was addicts, alcoholics, and mental health patients at an alumni reunion at Sierra Tucson. I don't know what's worse, hanging out with those junkies or coming here and hanging out with all you political junkies. So we'll find out in a few minutes. Pretty similar. So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is the continuation of the Conspiracy of Hope project that we launched last week right here. Many of you were here. How many of you actually were here last week? Yay, thanks for coming back. And how many of you, this is the first of the 4 event experiences that you have attended? Yay, thanks for coming. Fantastic. So this is what we're doing. We are reclaiming our public square. That's the theme. I know that each of you, like me, is committed to something, or you wouldn't be here on this incredibly rainy, wet, wonderful desert rain day. My name's George Durrani. I have been a part of the spiritual community here at St. Francis really since 1991. This is my spiritual home. St. Francis in the Foothills has always been committed to making a difference in the community and in the world. And although we can't support specific candidates or take a stand on specific issues, we believe strongly in social activism, social justice, progressive causes, civil rights, and human rights, and social responsibility. We have for years been committed to refugees. And in fact, our community center right now is housing a group of refugees as we're doing this right here. We're the founding members, one of the founding members of the Pima County Interfaith Council. We've been a sanctuary church, and we have a long list of other causes that we've been committed to for many, many years. If you're interested in what we're about, I want you, after we're done, to spend some time greeting and meeting our welcome team and asking questions. We have 3 services here every Sunday, 7:45, 9 o'clock, and 10:45. All right, let's switch what we're actually here to talk about. We believe, as former President Obama said about a month ago, that this upcoming general election is the single most important election of the last 50 years. In light of what we witnessed in November of 2016, in the past 2 years, and just in the past 3 weeks, most of you probably agree with what I just said and what Obama just said. And as we know, the election's only 3 weeks away. It's November the 6th. The last day to register in Arizona is now behind us. So there's really only one powerful thing left for you to do beyond those things we're going to talk about today. And that is to actually vote. You can be a critic, an observer, a pundit, a philosopher, an advocate, a student, or a teacher of our politics, and never actually vote in an election. You can do that. But if you want to reclaim the public square, if you really want to make a difference there, you have to vote. So do that. Now in your chairs is a flyer for the events that are still coming up. Next week, for example, I'm going to introduce this lady here in a moment, but next week is the 3rd part of our series, and it is called the Convergence of Politics and Spirituality. And the man who's going to deliver that is Dr. David Wilkinson, who's here with us again today. Thank you for being here, David. We're going to skip a week, and then on November the 3rd, we're going to have a musical event right here celebrating our democracy. There'll be a band, there will be some individual singers, there'll be a guitarist, duo, a couple of them are here today. So come back on November the 3rd to celebrate our democracy. Bring your dancing shoes and your singing voices, in that order. All right, some housekeeping. The restrooms are in the lobby on either side. There's water available out there. We're going to wrap by 6 p.m. There'll be a short series of questions and answers after Professor Sanchez, who I'll introduce in a moment, concludes her remarks. And then we'll take up a collection, because this is, after all, a church. And we depend on you to help us cover our expenses, so be generous in that regard. Now let me tell you a little bit more about the context of what we're doing here. Okay? This is the second part of that four-part series. Last week we had Dr. Barbara Norinder here from the University of Arizona School of Government and Public Policy, and her topic was polarization. How did we get here, basically? The themes for the four lectures are education, confrontation, inspiration, and celebration. Today is about really confronting what we learned about last week, which is this idea of polarization, and what we can do to get beyond that. I learned a lot last week. In fact, that some of it was counterintuitive. I learned some things that I didn't really fully appreciate. One of the things I learned is that we've been here before, right? Even though the ground feels like it's quaking and trembling and we're going to fall through a crack, this has been something that we have experienced and has occurred in our politics before, more than once. So I got a little bit of comfort out of that. And by the way, it's a conspiracy of hope, so we want you to leave here with a sliver of hope. So today we've got Professor Lisa Sanchez, who's also from the University of Arizona School of Government and Public Policy. And she's addressing the theme of confrontation, what it is, what we're confronted with. And it's a continuation of the discussion of polarization. Like, what's beyond polarization? She's an assistant professor. She holds a master's degree in American politics and public policy and a doctorate in political science from the University of New Mexico. She's an alumnus of the McNair program, the APSA Minority Fellows Program, and the Robert Wood Johnson Center for Health Policy. She's focused her research on the relationship between a rising U.S. Latino population and its electoral impacts within the United States Congress. She works on projects related to the intersection of legislative politics, race and ethnicity, and political behavior. Those are subjects that are near and dear to the hearts of many of the people that attend this church. Her other research interests include legislative representation with particular regard to how minority influences affect policies such as health and immigration. Again, the bell rings for me around that stuff. So, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Professor Lisa Sanchez.
The symptom and not really describing the disease. Is it that we can't agree on things? I think that's part of it. What it sort of is when we discuss it in terms of political science, you're going to see something like this graph here. It looks complex, it's really not. What it's showing you is that if we take into account all of the votes that members of Congress take over the Congresses, so starting in 1865, and this one here is going only to 2005, what you see is that on average, Democrats and Republicans are moving away from each other in terms of ideology, in terms of what they believe. That's really all this is showing you. It's showing you that Republicans in general don't agree and don't believe the same things that Democrats do. It's problematic, right? So what is polarization? It's really a measure of overlap. And today it means a measure of the lack of overlap between these two parties. So this is sort of your standard, the standard graph that everybody's going to show you. But there's been some neat work here recently that's we kind of jokingly call congressional mitosis. And what it's showing here in these graphs, you see along the top, it's 1949 to 1955, so these are by Congress. And then on the bottom, I've taken out the middle years just sort of to give you an idea of where this is going. From 2005 to 2011, I believe it is. And what it's showing you is what's called a social network analysis of all the members of Congress within these each Congress. And basically what you're supposed to see is that, like mitosis, this egg is dividing, right, over time. You're seeing, there's all these nodes, so each blue and red dot is a member of Congress. So you see in 1949, or even particularly in 1951, there's a whole lot of overlap. We see a lot of mixing of Republicans and Democrats, and they're engaging with each other on things like legislation and bill sponsorship and crossing partisan lines to vote on policies and get things passed that are needful and useful for the country. But then you get to 2005, and you see one lone Democrat there, right in the middle. In 2007, you're seeing one lone Republican. And I think that's an important thing to remember, because depending on what side of the aisle you're on, it's really easy to say it's those Republicans or it's those Democrats, but it's both. I mean, the standard sort of, if we go back to this graph, the standard, explanation is that Republicans are moving more quickly away from Democrats than Democrats are moving away from Republicans. And there's, certainly the data bears that out, but they're both moving. And I think that's kind of the important thing to take away from this graph. They're both moving away from each other. So there's nobody who's sort of blameless in this game we call politics. So we know what polarization is. It's a lack of overlap, and this congressional mitosis shows it quite well. The overlap is just going away. Oops, it is pretty quick. So an overview of kind of what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to go through a couple of myths, or what I like to kind of discuss as misunderstandings about polarization and where it comes from. Then I'm going to kind of, I also need to go back to preschool and learn how to number. Then I'm going to go to sort of structural changes and things like, things that we could change that are going to be really difficult to change, but would ease some polarization, or at least we believe they would. That'll be point 2, not 3. And then fourth, we're going to just kind of talk about what could you do about it today. If you wanted to go out today and change polarization, is there anything you can do? And spoiler alert, there are things you can do. Will they make an enormous difference? Probably not, but it'll make a difference in your environment, which is, I think, important in and of itself. And I think it spreads. So that's kind of where we're going. So first myth, right? Oh man, another typo. What's going on here? We've never seen polarization like this before. That's our first myth. Not true. So what you're seeing here is a picture of the caning of Charles Sumner. And this was pre-Civil War, and this was literally a time when a member of Congress got his walking cane. And when you hear the description of this, the historical description of this, it talks about the fact that he's holding a cane. It's the type you would use to make unruly dogs settle down, right? It's really that thick description in the Congressional Register. And he goes, and there was some incivility, and one thing leads to another, and we actually see one member of Congress use his cane and beat him over the head, another member of Congress over the head repeatedly. So that is to say, what we see today is not as bad as this. Now, it doesn't feel good that we have incivility, but at least we don't see members of Congress beating each other on the House or Senate floor. So we've been here before, right? Here's your other standard graph, and we can tell that right there, and I think Barbara Norander may have discussed this as well, but that part there, so what it's showing you is the distance between parties. And so the higher the number, or the higher it is on the graph, the more polarized the House or the Senate is. And you can see they follow about the same trajectory. Maybe the Senate's a little lower. But what you can tell is that over time, we've always been pretty high. Yes, we're getting a little bit higher than we were sort of initially. You can see that green dotted line. But that part I circled, that's actually not the norm. So what we're yearning for in politics is a time that is usually not business as usual. Yes, it doesn't make it any less meaningful to get back to, but it's not what politics is normally about. There's some level in politics that is, in our country, innately somewhat uncivil and open to disagreement. So polarization, it shouldn't scare us in and of itself. It's not sort of reason for despair, but the symptoms of what overpolarization creates is what I think we're worried about. Myth 2, this is all Congress's fault. Spoiler alert, it's not all their fault, it's our fault.
No.
So sadly, yeah, no, right? I wanted to make this sort of hopeful, but in its own way, because it's our fault, there is hope for it, right? Because if we're reclaiming the public square, as George eloquently put, then if it's our fault, we can easily reclaim it, because it's ours. So it looks like kind of a smoking gun when I show you these graphs that look like this, and Congress is getting more polarized, obviously. And then here we see Congress is getting less and less able to do the business of Congress, which is partially passing bills, right? So this is showing you the number of bills passed by Congress between 1947 and 2016. And that big arrow on the end is showing you kind of, our most recent data of where we are. And you can tell over time we've had a steady decrease in the number of bills. Now there's a couple reasons behind this that are not related to polarization. One being congressional rules that change the number of co-sponsors you can have on a bill to an unlimited amount, so you don't have any more duplicate bills. However, this is bills that are passed by Congress. So that's not likely to affect the number that are passed that much. So polarization is having this effect that creates gridlock where we're unable to agree, so much so that the business of the United States is not getting done. And I think there's no place that's sort of more evident than the way we're passing budgets these days. We can't just pass an annual budget, we have to pass these constant stopgap measures. And every time we pass a stopgap measure, there has to be sort of this out-and-out fear that maybe this time we won't do it, that the government is going to have to shut down, and does shut down from time to time. So, I mean, it definitely seems like this is Congress's fault. But let's take a step back. You have to think about what is Congress's sort of number one job? What do we want out of Congress as citizens? Two things probably come to mind. I know they do for me. Do we want them to pass bills? Or do we want them to represent? And I think it's important to kind of grapple with which one of these that we're actually hoping for, because if we hope for them to pass bills, well then that means in some way they're going to have to agree that compromise is what should be ruling the day. Now if we want them to represent, what we're likely to see is differing ideals, differing opinions, people disagreeing, public discourse. And that's going to look a lot different and a lot more like polarization. So takeaway from this slide is, yeah, one of their jobs is to pass bills. But as members of Congress see it, their biggest role in the national government is to represent each and every one of you. And represent you so strongly that they won't actually give in to compromise. And you'll sort of see that in a second. So why are they divided? Because most, and the MCs here is members of Congress, sort of a shorthand, most members of Congress represent districts that are highly partisan. So here's where it gets to the tough part, where I'm sort of putting the onus and the blame squarely on us. So this is showing you data from 2017, and it's the Partisan Voter Index scores. And those are really just Cook Partisan puts together a nice score that tells you and takes into account how Democratic leaning or how Republican leaning a district is. And not to get too deeply into this, but the darker the color, the more partisan you are. So darker blue means more Democrat, darker red means more Republican. So what this graph is showing you is, based on districts, I don't know about you, but I see a lot of dark colors up there. I don't see a lot of light colors. And what's that saying is members of Congress are an outgrowth of the people they represent. If you are representing a district that is staunchly Democratic, why do we think that our member of Congress is going to come out and be any different? So, one of the outgrowths of this process of them having very partisan districts is that they're very safe. And that's, I mean, safe electorally. And this is some data here showing you the number of House districts that are sort of Republican-leaning, are Republican-strong versus Democratic-strong. You see those sort of polls on each end, right? Versus in the middle, where you actually have sort of a toss-up, and there's not very many of those. And there's not very many that are just Democratic or Republican-leaning. So what we're seeing is what we call a bimodal distribution, a fancy way to say that we see most of the cases occurring in two categories. And what we call this in the profession is the incredible shrinking swing seat. This is data from 1997 to 2017, so we don't have to go back very far to find data to suggest that these toss-up districts, what we call swing seats, are disappearing entirely. So that gray line down there is showing you the number of seats that we feel like are swing seats. And by the way, this is built off of the Cook Partisan Index, and we say that those that are swing seats are D+5 to R+5, so kind of in the middle of the spectrum. And by the way, the spectrum is quite large. It can go up to D+27, I think I've seen, maybe even some in the 30s. Maybe somebody else, maybe John knows. So I'm not sure how high it's ever gotten to, but suffice it to say, in 1997, we had 164 districts that we considered to be swing seats or toss-up seats. Fast forward to 2016, and that's almost halved, 72 districts between D+5 and R+5, or swing seats. So competition is also one of these outgrowths that we're seeing of this strong representational aspect to Congress. So, long story short, there's really no incentive for these members of Congress to compromise. And why am I so comfortable saying it? Well, think about it. Why would a member of Congress who wins 80% of the vote in her district, in a district comprised of 85% Democrats, ever work with this guy, an MC or a member of Congress who wins 70% of the vote in a district comprised of 65% Republicans? There is no incentive. He is going to win, and she is going to win every single time, unless, something really catastrophic happens. And therefore, they're going to keep doing exactly what they're doing because they believe it's what gets them reelected. They're representing so well that we keep returning them to Congress every time. So, long story short, they would. And I love this picture because it looks like John Boehner's crying, but it's sort of far stray. He actually had terrible allergies during the State of the Union and was kind of wiping his eyes by that. But yeah, it's a great one. So, what I mean to say here is that they are divided because we are divided. And there's a couple of ways of also showing this, not just that data I showed you from the districts with the Cook Partisan Index, but even electorally when we look at specific races, and even when we look at things like social media, which is so hot right now, as a sort of a new form of data, we're seeing that results by county for the presidential elections in 2016 are very partisan. So how can I tell that from all this gobbledygook? Well, the darker the color, again, it's set up nicely, the darker the color, the more partisan that district was. So the more highly they voted for either candidate. And so you see a lot of dark red. You definitely see a good deal of dark blue. Now, the same sort of deal is going on in that corner with the social network analysis of political retweets. And what this is showing you, and I like this, and I include this because it looks a lot like that congressional mitosis I showed you earlier where we see them pulling apart. Well, the same thing is happening here. What we're seeing is that you have blue, which are Democrats, and retweeting Democratic political content, and the red sort of separate and retweeting red or Republican political content. You're not seeing a lot of overlap. And what that's showing you too is that people are already sort of decided. So the masses are already sort of decided on what they believe politically. So there's no need to retweet something that doesn't agree with what they believe, right? There's no need to engage with that other side. If that's not evidence of polarization, I don't know what is, right, among the masses. Now, I'll add an interesting piece to all of this, in terms of, you know, we keep sending these guys back, right? This guy, this lady, this guy, we keep sending them back, and they're winning at really high election rates. We call that the incumbency advantage in my business. And part of what goes on here is kind of interesting. We call it Fenno's paradox. And it's just basically this idea that we love our own member of Congress and will continue to vote for them and continue to send them back to Congress, but we hate Congress as an institution, which is, it's pretty intellectually dishonest for us to do that, and yet here we are. So what we're feeling is that our member of Congress is good, our member of Congress can do no wrong, but it's that other guy. And so again, I'm sort of laying it squarely on us that this is the kind of behavior that incentivizes members of Congress to behave as they do. Oops. And here's some more data to back up Fenno's paradox. So we love our member of Congress, but we're angry at Congress very frequently, right? So this is showing you, let's see, do you approve or disapprove of the way Congress is handling its job? And this was from 2011 to 2013. And the green line is just sort of a moving average of how many people approve, right? And we see in 2013, only 14% of our population approves of a democratically elected branch of government. Isn't that sad? I mean, that should shake you a little bit. These are the people who we're kind of hanging our hat on. We have one president, and he's popularly elected, or, you know, at some level popularly elected, the Electoral College being what it is. But and then we have the Supreme Court, yet we don't trust the very people who we feel are among us, they're from us, and that they're there to represent us. So it's our own fault, right? We love our congressmen, but we hate what's coming out of Congress, but we keep telling our congressman to go and do that, go back and keep doing what he's doing. And what he or she is doing is being partisan and being polarized and not compromising. And we keep rewarding them for it. And until we stop rewarding them for it, they're going to continue to do this. So there you have it. Our polarized Congress can't get anything done because our members of Congress are actually doing a really good job at representing us.
Yikes.
Why are they so responsive? That's kind of the question I know my undergrads would ask me. Okay, well, why are they so responsive to us? Why do they care so much what we think? Well, a guy named David Mayhew in 1974 came out with what was a really seminal work. Up to this point, work on Congress had kind of been sort of thick historical description. Woodrow Wilson kind of wrote a tome about how Congress worked, and it was full of procedural rules, and it was full of, you know, describing how members of Congress interacted with one another. But nobody had really grappled with what's driving these guys. Why are they doing this? What's in it for them? What are the incentives? You know, let's cut to the chase on this. In 1974, David Mayhew says, all right, I'll cut to the chase. Congress, the electoral connection is what is incentivizing these members to behave the way they do. So he basically posits that single-minded election seekers, that members of Congress are single-minded election seekers to the exclusion of everything else. And he says, let's see, let me read this here for those of you who it's too small to see. The discussion to come will hinge on the assumption that United States congressmen are interested in getting reelected. Indeed, in their role here as abstractions, interested in nothing else. That was a quote from David Mayhew's book. And kind of the theory that follows that really stark, shocking statement is this idea that came out of, again, Fenno's coming up here. Fenno's tripod is what we call this, where there's really three things that members of Congress are trying to achieve. The first one of them, which we'll talk a lot about here in a second, is re-election. Another is passing good public policy, and I put good in quotes because that depends on who you are and what district you're from. And also, gaining influence in Congress. And according to Fenno and Mayhew later, they're all very closely connected to one another. They all kind of feed each other. But the one thing that David Mayhew says that has to be achieved for any of these other goals to be achieved is re-election. Because if you're not sitting in Congress, you're not passing good public policy, and you're not going to gain any influence with your party to continue to pass good public policy. So it is the re-election goal is the thing that you have to put foremost in your mind in order that you can do anything else that you want to achieve in Congress. So that kind of flipped the whole discipline on its head at the time. And basically what he was saying, and why this was so shocking to everyone, was this idea that you get elected or re-elected so that you can pass policy, make laws, pass bills, represent. He said, oops, let's see, did it flip? Yeah, he said no. He said, you're actually passing policy to get re-elected. This was huge, right? The discipline went crazy at this time because, I mean, it's saying that these are not altruistic public servants. That's what it's sort of calling out. It's saying that they are playing by a set of rules, and the incentives are that if they want to get reelected, they have to do things that look good to their constituents and districts. And that means that everything they do in Congress is simply in service of them keeping their job. And I think a lot of us can actually kind of relate to this. It seems very smarmy and cynical when we put it this way, but you know, why do any of us do the things that we do at work? Well, because we have to keep our job. And why do we want to keep our job? Because we probably like it at some level. And we want to eat, right? And possibly wear clothes and keep a house. So members of Congress, likewise, are doing a very similar thing. So it shouldn't be shocking to us that they're engaging in this kind of behavior. It's human at that level. Oops. All right, so hopefully I've shaken you to your core with David Mayhew. Myth 3. Gerrymandering is the root of all evil. So I missed Barbara Norander's talk last week because I was actually at a conference at UA that had to do with redistricting in Arizona. We're on the precipice of having the 2020 census, and there's a lot of talk about how are we going to redraw the lines in Arizona. This has been a kind of a battleground for gerrymandering and for racial gerrymandering and partisan gerrymandering for quite a while. So the idea behind this conference was that we would get everybody, kind of stakeholders and community members together and people who are much smarter about gerrymandering than I am, together and talk about, well, what are the best ways to do this? And one of the interesting things that came out of it is that there's a couple of researchers, one named Moon Duchin, I think? Duchin? Is that right? Yeah, John was there with me. So what some of her work is actually suggesting, and there's a couple other teams across the country who are doing this as well, she's a mathematician by trade, not a political scientist. But what they're doing with, basically with statistics, is suggesting that good shapes don't necessarily mean good outcomes. And bad shapes, in terms of shapes of districts, don't necessarily mean bad outcomes. What's going on is really that we need to look more deeply into what the outcomes of these districts are to decide whether they're fair or not. Because if it's favoring a certain, it may be, it may follow all the rules of contiguity and what else? I'm drawing a blank. Yeah, there we go. Contiguity, compactness. It may make sure that we have, one person, one vote. It's roughly the same size of the population. We have all these rules we've set up, and yet we can still have poor outcomes from those districts. Now, I guess that's sort of an aside because I just thought it was fascinating, fantastic work. And I think it's something certainly that I hadn't considered, because the way I was trained was you have a bad shape, a gerrymandered shape, one that kind of doesn't look right or feel right, you're going to have negative outcomes. But kind of flipped it on its head. That was all to say, even though gerrymandering seems like the root of all evil, the thing that we can all agree is bad, it actually doesn't have a whole heck of a lot to do with polarization. It doesn't help, don't get me wrong there, it doesn't help polarization in any way, but it's really not the smoking gun that most people assume it is. And why am I so comfortable saying that? Well, this graph here, this, you've already seen it once before, I've already described it to you once before. Well, the one thing I may not have pointed out enough is that the House, the red line is the House, and the blue line is the Senate. Well, they're both undergoing this polarization process. The House a little bit more than the Senate, but they're both undergoing it at pretty much the same curvature and same rate. So what does that mean for gerrymandering? Senate is not redistricted. The Senate is states. There's no redrawing of lines there. So there's no way that the smoking gun can be gerrymandering. It just doesn't make sense if they're both undergoing this process. Now, there could be things about the population, right, that are inherent in states that make them sort of more or more towards one political party or another. And we definitely see that to be true. People don't choose randomly where they live. At least I don't think so. And the person doesn't think so. But long story short, gerrymandering is not the be-all end-all. And so if we're always focusing on this drawing of district lines to take away part of polarization, it's never going to help us. We're still going to be sort of having the same issues we have had before. Sort of a corollary to this, and what we usually hope to see out of gerrymandering is that we increase competition in the districts. So gerrymandering gets such a bad rap, and redistricting gets a bad rap because we think it's drawing lines to get some particular outcome, some unfair outcome. And usually that outcome is very one-sided, or we believe it to be. Well, the outgrowth of that, or what comes out of that line of thinking, is that if we increase the competition in each of those districts, we'll actually end up with less polarization. So we don't have to draw, we can redraw the district lines, and if it increases competition, maybe it's the lack of competition that's leading to polarization. Well, surprise, it's not. Electoral competition actually doesn't help as much as you think, and it all kind of hinges on this idea of convergence in the median voter theorem. Median voter theorem, they give you a little diagram, and you can look at it, but suffice it to say, what happens in the primaries is you have very partisan individuals voting. So you have a very, very Democratic, very deeply steeped Democratic candidate, a very deeply steeped Republican candidate, and they're running in their own party. There's usually a lot of competition there, and you have highly partisan individuals, and so those candidates actually make themselves seem as partisan as possible because they're talking to their home base, right? They have to seem truly partisan and truly like they're one of this party. Well, they win their primaries, and then come election season, median voter theorem says, well, yeah, but they're no longer just running among partisans. So all of a sudden, you see the numbers of the candidates actually start to come screaming towards the center to kind of get the least common denominator in their district. And that should be the median voter, the person who's dead center in the middle of their district. Well, what a couple of researchers have found recently that, if you increase competition, the logic says you should increase this idea that you get the median voter and that parties become more moderate, right? That's the outgrowth. Well, what actually happens is that because you have very competitive districts, you start to see these candidates not kind of converge in the middle anymore, but they're staying out at the polls because they have to make themselves seem different enough to get voters excited and to continue to get their base excited, right? And also, part of the sad fact, and another piece of this, the work by these folks suggests that the median voter is always voting. So you have these really deeply partisan individuals on both sides, and still, those are the base. Those are the people you're going to have voting for you. So you're not seeing them converge anymore. They're still staying out at the polls. So competition actually might not help as much as you might think. And therefore, here's another sort of strike against this myth about gerrymandering is the be-all and all of polarization.
Give me some hope, Dr. Sanchez.
I'm trying. We'll get there, I promise. So, I had to break you down before I can hold you back up. So, it's not convergence, it's not sort of electoral competition. Myth 4, it's not all about money. And that should give you some hope, I think. Most people think it's all about money. Most people think money and donors are giving money to members of Congress or elected officials, and that changes how they vote. Not true. Research has sort of unequivocally said, this is not happening. What is happening is donors are getting to those who they already agree with. And they're keeping those people in power. So, this could be leading somewhat to polarization, right? Because the people who are already polarized are firmly ensconced in the United States Congress by individuals helping them gain money to be reelected and to stay in office. But it's not changing their minds. It's not causing them to vote differently than they would. And the second piece to this one, kind of breaking down the money myth, is donors often give to both sides. It's kind of a dirty secret. And especially the more money you have, the more likely you are to give to kind of both sides. And so the question always my undergrads ask me is, what is that buying? Then why do they give the money? It doesn't seem rational. Well, they're buying access. They know that they can get on the phone and say, hey, I want to talk to the congressman. I donated $50,000, whatever, however much money to your campaign. And yeah, it does grant them some access if there's more money given, right? And sort of research has bared that out. So money's not the smoking gun either. All right, now, so we're getting into the hope part, I promise. So there's this other myth out there, and it's called the two Americas. There's one red America and there's a blue America. There's a Republican America and a Democratic America, and there's no purple America. And this is true in part, but I think it's a little more complex than sort of the media would have you believe. So this is data showing you kind of this whole idea is overlap, right? Polarization, I told you, is all about overlap. 1994, you see in that line there, I don't know, does this have a, nice. So you see this right here. In 1994, you see a lot of little mountain here that's like a purple color. That's overlap. That's less polarization, right? 2004, we start to see the mountains kind of pulling apart a little bit, but we're still seeing the mountain. 2014, now we see the mountains pulling apart a good deal. And this is starting to erode. And yet, it's still there. So I would say we're not as polarized as a lot of individuals would have you believe, because we still have that mountain in the middle. And how do we get why is that mountain wearing away though? And here's an interesting piece of this. And I think, everyone always says, please get out and vote, and I don't want to negate that in any way. But in some level, it's voters who are creating this ideological problem in a huge way. So this is the ideological distribution of voters. So when we ask a sample of voters to place themselves on sort of a liberal conservative scale, what we find is that voters, people who actually go and cast a ballot, have this bimodal distribution, right? So remember I told you bimodal was a bunch of observations in two big categories. Well, there you see kind of the middle falling out among voters. But our salvation may lie in the non-voters, which is interesting because again, this is more fodder for this electoral connection. They're not voting. They're less ideologically polarized, and therefore, if they may be engaged, we actually might see some differences about who is in Congress and how they behave in Congress in order to keep these folks happy. So how can I tell that so easily? Well, you have a nice bell curve. We love bell curves in science, right? It feels right. So you see a lot of people in this middle section, what we would call moderates, and very few people out in the polls, what we would call polarized. And therefore, these non-voters are really the folks who are being are the ideal of non-polarized Americans, I guess is how I put it. But this is all to say, there are reasons to fret, and I definitely think there are, but that's not reasons to despair. So one thing I'd like to remind you of is, there's my baby. So one thing I'll remind you of is that the whole system was built this way. So part of this polarization and the inability to pass laws and what we see an inability to get things done, this is the process that it takes to get a bill passed. So I know probably a lot of you have seen the cartoon How a Bill Becomes a Law, Schoolhouse Rock. Anybody seen that? Yeah? Yeah, Schoolhouse Rock, right, yeah. So it makes it seem like this really simple process. The fact of it is, it's nothing, there's no way that it's simple, right? It has so many veto points built in, places where bills can die, where a bill can just, stop going forth in the legislative process. And then there's so many people who have to say yes in this process that, there are significant structural reasons why we don't see a lot of things coming out of Congress. And it was built this way because the founders thought, we don't want to have these huge policy swings all the time. It should be hard to get something legislatively on the books because everybody has to be in lockstep in order for something that important federally to get enacted. So if everybody's not in lockstep, then it's a good reason that it shouldn't be a law, or so the founders thought. So what can be done? First thing, change the incentives of members of Congress. So one thing that's sort of suggested, and it's definitely not, there's always going to be unintended consequences to any of these, but one is term limits. So that's going to change the incentives quite drastically. So maybe members of Congress Congress are only allowed to say in a certain number of terms. And so in the end, you might see them acting more like what we would call trustees, which is they vote how they feel the country should be going, and how their conscience and how their gut says they should go, instead of as delegates, which is this electoral connection idea where you have the district saying, we want you to vote like this, and the member of Congress saying, okay, I'll vote just like that. So term limits might sever that link at some level. You know, it's a question, right? We don't have term limits, so we don't know for certain. We do see some effects in other countries, but again, structurally different systems. Second thing we might be able to do is get more non-voters involved in the process. And one of the ways it's been, you know, easily you can think of is to change voting laws. Things like making sure that ID laws are not really on the books. We know that affects disproportionately certain segments of our population. Latinos being one of them. Also, interestingly, homeless individuals are heavily affected by these ID laws because in essence they can vote, but they're unable to in a lot of states because they don't have a picture ID and probably not a vehicle to get across town to the one office that's going to give them that voter ID. So they're unlikely to, you know, sort of engage in the process. Other things might be making everybody registered at 18. That's another idea. Maybe things like making Election Day a holiday, which my students laugh and they tell me, I don't know if I would actually vote. I'd probably go to the beach somewhere. So, you know, we're a country of vacationers and travelers, so I can see that happening. But I mean, you get the point. So we could sort of change these laws and try and get more people involved. We talk a lot about mobilization, and yet we really don't put our money where our mouth is on that. Kind of the third thing, and where a lot of my research lies, is that population shifts might help. So this is really not something we're doing, but is happening currently. So this is showing you the racial composition of the United States, and it's showing you from 1950 and then projected out to 2050, I apologize. And you're seeing whites are in green, Latinos are in red, black African American are in blue, and then white is sort of other. So Asian and Native American, and you know, anything you can think of would be in that other category. And really the movement here is that you're not seeing African American populations move almost at all. They're really sort of at a stasis in terms of population growth. We see the other category kind of eking up, but it's, you know, between 0 and 10%, so not a huge change. Where we really see a big difference is white populations are falling drastically. And then backfilling that is Latino populations. So we're starting to see Latinos really become a part of our electorate all of a sudden. And there's we refer to this as the Latino diaspora. So 1970, we saw not only increases, over time, we've seen not only increases in the Latino population, but also where they live and where they're beginning to reside. So they were in 9 states in the 1970s where they were the largest minority group, all in the Southwest pretty much, you know, where you would think they would be. 2010, wow. We have 29 states where Latinos are the largest minority group, so we're really starting to see them move. And actually, if we project this out even further, this is the area in the South where we're really starting to see them move to and increase in huge numbers. And that has some impacts. And so what my research looks at is, well, when you start to change the population, you're doing something that's almost like gerrymandering, right? You're changing who is voting and who is engaging in politics in those districts, but you're actually not manufacturing it, right? So these people are moving there of their own volition. So what happens, right? You have new voices in a district, and particularly in the South, you have very conservative voices all of a sudden being mixed with these more liberal Latino voices, and you start to see some changes going on in the population. And what I find is that it actually kind of goes, there's a transitional period. So what's going on here is that you see, this is the district demographic heterogeneity. That's just a fancy word for saying the population is shifting and changing to become more minority, right? There's increases, it's not just white anymore. And over here we see ideological extremity, and that's kind of, you know, another word for they're polarized at this point, right? They're out at the polls and they have extreme opinions. Well, what we see is when there's a low level of Latinos or district heterogeneity in an area, we see low levels of ideological extremity. But as you increase, and what my research finds is at about 30% is up here at the top of this curve. Until you increase to 30%, what you see is a phenomenon called racial threat among white populations. They become afraid of these Latinos who are coming into districts. So this is not the hopeful part, but what you're seeing is increasing levels of polarization. This has been going on for a couple of decades, right? We've been seeing Latinos move. I showed you since 1970, we're seeing this movement. Well, when they get to this point, at about 30%, my research suggests it flips over, and it actually starts to kind of work its way, and the population figures out how to live together, in other words. And by the way, it's not just whites who become more extreme in this process at the first part of this curve, it's also Latinos, because they feel this acute minority status, because there's not enough of them to make a difference, and yet they feel like they're sort of being trampled on, because you see all these passage of very punitive laws at the state level. But then once they reach this 30% mark, there's enough, and there's been enough experience with them, my research suggests, that all of a sudden, they're able to kind of live together and not have experience acute minority status and racial threat, and things, start to go down. So, what I argue to you is that as we start to see this wave, this, I guess we could call it a brown wave, which is a terrible term, this Latino wave across the United States, you might actually start to see polarization work itself out naturally at some level. Okay, so I promised you I'd tell you what you can do today. Well, the first thing I would encourage you strongly to do is be uncomfortable. I know we all kind of balk against that. We don't want to be uncomfortable. But that's things like being careful about your media consumption. And I know my father and my father-in-law have very different opinions on media and consume media very differently. And it's very obvious to me that it impacts what they believe. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that don't watch that media source you always watch. Watch something else. And watch it with an open mind. And watch it for a while. Because I guarantee you the media is not blameless in all this. The media has a vested interest in making it seem like there is something provocative and exciting going on. And so they're going to, I told my husband just the other day while we were watching the news, I said, they love using the term divided America. I just love it because it seems so exciting, like there's something really wrong here. And yeah, we're divided on certain issues, but on things that matter to the United States, I think the interesting part is the data shows we all care about education, we're all caring about having health care, we all care about these things. We all have sort of the same goals, it's just we have different means. And that's what gets us in trouble, is the means. And so part of also being uncomfortable is befriending those you don't agree with, talking with them. Not just talking to win either, which is sort of my next point. Don't focus on winning. We focus so much on winning an argument, winning the political point, and we're not actually listening. We're not taking in information. Part of this is that you have to be willing to take in information. And I know for me, even, I study this stuff and I know the effects, it's still hard, but I think it's doable. And I actually assign my students usually to watch a different news source for a week and see what the outcomes are. And initially what I find is they're initially very angry. When they first start watching those new news sources, they say, that's crazy, how could they even say that? And then the longer they watch them, the more they're like, okay, I don't agree with that, but I can understand where they're coming from. And that's what you want to get to. Learn about new cultures. Don't stay in our enclaves. In the United States recently, another kind of divide we have is racial and ethnic, right? We tend to live in enclaves. If we're white, we live with other white people. If we're Latino, we live with other Latino people. If we're black, we live with other black people. That's not helping anybody. Our school system is more segregated now than it was before Brown v. Board of Education. And there's no law requirement now. So again, this onus is partially on us, right? Value others. I think that's actually important in this. So everybody has some value, even if, sort of a skinhead Nazi you might think is morally repugnant. They have value, and there's something driving them. And look for the value behind the human, not just the political point. Don't win. It's not always about winning. One thing I think is really interesting, and my husband and I have been talking about this a lot recently. He brought it up, so yay, Charles. One thing we've been talking a lot lately is that in U.S. politics, and this hasn't been tested, so it's something I would like to do in the future, but we usually assume that when you favor something, you have abject disgust and you hate the alternative. Think about the Coca-Cola or Pepsi challenge, right? We always think, when somebody says, okay, well, which one do you prefer, Coke or Pepsi? And you say Coke, and they're like, what? You hate Pepsi? I love Pepsi. That's that sort of logic, right? That because, most people, they'll just choose because we're giving them a choice. And we see this a lot in polling data as well. You choose because somebody gives you the choice, but there's not a lot behind it. And that's another sort of myth about this divided America's idea that a lot of opinions are somewhat, we don't allow for nuance. So the choices we give you are polarized, so you look polarized, right? Let's see, what else? Use the electoral advantage to use the electoral connection to your advantage. So if you want your members of Congress to stop sort of winning the point and you want them to be more bipartisan, vote for politicians who are more bipartisan. Vote for somebody maybe you don't agree with entirely but might work more with other members of Congress. Vote for somebody who's more moderate, even though you might be a very partisan individual. If you really care about kind of pulling down polarization, it's us who's doing the voting. It's us who's putting them in power. So vote for somebody different. Don't, my father-in-law loves to say that, the most insane thing you can do is keep doing the same thing and expecting different results. And I think that's what we're doing in this country right now. We're keeping and voting polarized and voting for the same people and saying, well, I don't understand why nothing changed. I think that's a huge problem. And I guess I'll end this with what one of my professors back at UNM used to say during every class. He would say, reasonable minds can disagree. And I think you have to keep that in mind. However much you care about your position, reasonable minds can disagree. Don't hate that person. Understand them. I guess that's all I have.
So thank you. We're going to have some Q&A in a few moments, but I want to do a couple of things first. And there's someone here who's desperate to see you. We are going to pass the baskets right now, so please be generous in helping us cover our costs. I want to remind you about a couple of things. One is next week, same time, Dr. David Wilkinson's Inspiration, the Convergence of Politics and Spirituality. Please come, bring others. Also on Friday of this coming week is The Four Gents. There's a musical show, a vocal group, really, really good. They're going to be here Friday night. Please come. If you haven't already bought tickets, get your tickets and bring somebody to that show. All right. We've got about 20 minutes or so for Q&A. And we're going to let the baskets get through, and then we'll do the microphones here. Let's turn these on. I learned two things already, actually. One is I need to bone up on my Spanish because of the Latino wave that's coming. And I guess I got to keep listening to Rush Limbaugh. Yikes. All right, so Julie's got one of the mics. So who's got the first question? Right here.
Tim.
Hi, my name is Laurel, and I haven't been able to go up and sing as much as I'd like to, not by a long shot. So to assuage my conscience, I heard from a couple of people that there's an organization called Flippable that has a 3-year strategic set of ambitions to put some red districts blue.
Okay.
They talk a lot about gerrymandering and how, that's an important issue. If I want to give a chunk of money to somebody, who should I give it to? That's my question.
Well, it depends on your goal, right? So it depends on, in my opinion, depends on, do you want to sort of reinforce who is in Congress? So then give it to somebody new. So don't give it to an incumbent if you don't want to see that incumbent behave the way they have in the past.
I don't even know if I'm going to give it to. So I need to
This is Iowa this side. We're going to go back and forth.
Yeah, we're going to try to stay in some semblance of order too. So, but we'll have time for every question. Go ahead.
If I can be a reasonable mind disagree,
Sure.
this fits the same, it fits the data, and that is since, if I turn or not.
We just didn't turn your mic on. Hang on one second. There we go.
Since the 60s, since 80s, the Republican Party has become very ideological and rigid, and even though lobbyists go for other sides, there are people like the Kochs, the Elsteins, and others who have an ideological bent, and their dark money has a little cokehold on our representatives, so they're afraid of being primary. And just today, I don't know if you saw John Meekin's op-ed in the New York Times today, but in the race in Tennessee, they were both asked what would happen if the other side won. The Democrats said, you know, I'm sorry, but we'll try to work and make that person work, you know, to make her the best senator. And the other person said, I just couldn't have it because the Democrats and Nancy Pelosi and all the other bugaboos they use. It's the same thing that when Obama won, Mitch McConnell got together with the Koch brothers and said, we're going to oppose everything he does. So I'd like to talk about the rigid, and I'm an ex-Republican, by the way.
Okay.
So I'd just like to talk about the rigid ideological nature of the Republican Party and how it's become more and more. So I mean, like, I would like to vote Republican, but there's nobody I could vote for.
Sure. So yeah, I think it's an excellent point. So what's been going on in the Republican Party is somewhat of a schism, right? So we've seen a more moderate, more traditional Republican Party be kind of hijacked by the Tea Party movement. And therefore, you know, in order to kind of garner enough votes to do anything in Congress, you know, the Tea Party wins more often than not, wins the point, right? And so that's what sort of made them seem maybe more ideological and more rigid. And that's also part of the reason, remember I told you that on that graph, Republicans are moving away a little bit more quickly than Democrats. It's part of this is that Tea Party movement kind of taking over the Republican Party. As to, you know, I think it fits the story really well, right? I mean, ideologically and polarization-wise, this all makes sense in the story I told you, right? And you know, the Koch brothers giving money and all of this also is it's still sort of in service of keeping these people in power and allowing these Tea Partiers who started to move in to stay there. And I think that's why we're starting to see there's some rigidness even more increasing. And we're also starting to see people like John Boehner, who was more moderate, leave and not be politicians anymore. And then Paul Ryan also is another sort of, you know, more traditional Republican who's saying, hey, I don't want to play this game anymore. And so again, you're starting to see kind of a self-selection process that's even more making this, you know, process be more compact, I guess. Yeah, right?
So David Taylor next.
Yeah, this is somewhat on the same theme, but a solution that has been proposed, and I'd like to hear more about what you know about it, sort of from the scientific point of view. Automatic runoff voting. I think that's how it's termed, where people rank their choices, first, second, third, fourth. These are primaries, mainly. And so the least voted for get eliminated, and then they have the computers do this. Everybody, and this is supposedly a way to get more moderate candidates on the ballot. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so, I mean, getting on the ballot and I think winning a primary are two separate pieces. And I will admit sort of my bias, I don't study sort of alternate structures very frequently, like what you're suggesting. But sort of going off of what I know more globally about these type of structures, I mean, you will change the incentives in some way, right? If you were able to kind of have people rank and go through the process. But I still think the result is going to be that the same sort of individuals are going to win, and these are the people that really are more able to kind of show that they're kind of the blue-blooded, or I don't know, the most democratic or the most Republican of all, right? Coming out of these races. And still, I think it's going to be the strongest and the ones who gain the most money. I think it's still going to be a very similar process, is my feeling. And again, though, I don't study these very closely, so I'll give you that great result for now.
So Joyce, there's some of that, but
Can you identify some of the political leanings of the Latino community?
Sure. Yeah, so the Latino community primarily is Democratic, right? I mean, they lean Democratic. One kind of new phenomenon, where there's a very small population of Latino Republicans. Certainly they exist, and you know they're vibrant just the way the other Republicans might be. But one thing that we've seen recently changing is that Latinos are going in large numbers to become independents. And it's kind of, the big question is why. Some suggest that maybe it's sort of a disaffection with both parties or the partisan system. Some suggest that maybe because it's a large immigrant population, it may have something to do with socialization elsewhere, right? And that neither of these parties is really sort of what they understand as a political party. I don't put a lot of credence in that one. What else? So, I mean, the big question is, why are they all becoming independents? And some of the information could be kind of gleaned from what we know about their ideological standpoints. So partisan-wise, they appear to be Democratic pretty solidly. But when you ask them their ideology, what we do also see is, first of all, they usually call themselves moderates, right? And you definitely see a little bit more on the Democratic side in terms of ideology, or on the liberal side, and then still a few on the Republican side. But if you add in the choice of saying don't know or refuse to respond, the highest category is actually don't know, and that even outmasses this middle category of moderates. And so part of this could be they're becoming independents because there's something about this ideological spectrum that is sort of confusing or doesn't fit with Latinos and their ideological outlook. It's one place that I'm actually starting to research now.
that's a great question. Thank you. So who's next?
I just want,
Would you stand up?
my back is bothering me, I will say.
Okay, go ahead.
I wanted to share the good news on Amador and Company last night. Hagen Luber, governor of Colorado, and Kasich, Republican governor of Ohio, are setting out to model cooperation and finding a middle ground. They are consciously doing that, and there was like a 20-minute interview, and I urge you to Google that interview on Amador.
Thank you. There's somebody over there who's been waiting a while to go. Who's next?
Thank you. I very much appreciate your observations about political behavior, human behavior, but I disagree with some of the metrics I'm seeing. For example, both last week and this week, we're seeing charts that show how many bills Congress passed. To me, the number of bills is quite irrelevant. I mean, you could have a Congress that passed 1,700 bills last year that were meaningless. And the Civil Rights Bill this year, one bill, that's very meaningful. So how do you account for that in your research?
Great. Yeah, so part of this, you don't know what's in those metrics. I mean, you're absolutely right. There is some data that can actually kind of tease apart whether it's a resolution, which is more of and it has less impact. It's usually things like we would like to honor veterans, or they're important sort of psychologically, but there's no impact materially. So we can sort of take those out as well. But I mean, sort of the trend overall is, even when we're taking those out, the trend overall is still downward. We're still passing fewer and fewer pieces of legislation over time. And that also means, sort of on the whole, fewer and fewer important pieces of legislation are able to be passed as well. Another kind of nerve-wracking thing that's going on, and that could be accounting for some of these fewer bills being passed, is that we're starting to see the page length increase. Now, this is worrisome for a couple of reasons to me. So first of all, Nancy Pelosi famously said about the health care bill, don't worry about it, you can read it once we've passed it, right? And everybody just cringed, and I'm sure her staff was like, no! But, I mean, the point being is that once these bills get so long and so complex, representatives stop reading them, maybe their staffers stop reading them in whole, all of us are certainly not going to spend the time reading it because it's not our job, it's the job of our representatives. So, you know, it becomes, and the other piece that kind of comes out of this as well is that you get what we call Christmas tree bills, where people are hanging their own ornaments on it. That's why we call it a Christmas tree bill. And it allows sort of polarization to seep in even more insidiously because, you know, one staffer may be poring over the bill to find something that they find unamenable to their member of Congress so that they can kill that bill, right? By changing, you know, so instead of the whole focus being on maybe the main import of the bill, now we've changed the agenda and we've changed the focus and we're talking about this one tiny little piece that materially doesn't affect the main impact of the bill, but still kills it altogether. And so that's why this bill length increasing is actually kind of worrisome. And, you know, if I had my druthers, there would be, you know, sort of requirements, maybe not requirements, but I think it would be a better idea for them to pass smaller bills with fewer ornaments, and maybe political discourse would be slightly easier. But I think there's incentives for them not to, right, because of what I've just described.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's problematic.
All right, in the back. Yeah, go ahead.
My quick question on the impact of social media, disinformation, and people that aren't a part of the community and the demographics that we're showing other countries. Thanks.
Sure. So you're wanting to know kind of about how social media is impacting polarization or elections kind of broadly? Yeah, so that's kind of new, right? I have a piece out right now that deals with social media with a colleague, that deals with social media in such a way that it might actually promote less traditional candidates, I guess you might say, or what you might refer to as maybe dark horse candidates. I hesitate to use that term because it has some connotations. But candidates who might normally not be as competitive because they're able to use social media as a new resource. And it's so inexpensive. And once something catches fire on social media, it blows up, right? So there's this idea in politics, in political science, it's called pluralism. And it can be applied here as well. So pluralistically, we feel like there's a great body of resources for every, you know, for politics, right? So maybe if you don't have bodies, maybe you have plenty of money to sort of disseminate your message. Or maybe you have a lot of people behind you, you can do petitions. So there's these pluralistic ways, all these different ways you can get involved. And so everything evens out. It all comes out in the wash. So everything should be kind of fair in this pluralistic environment. Well, part of the problem is that usually people who have money also have bodies. Or, you know, there's a preponderance of resources for one candidate. And that's why incumbents become so strong. They have advantages based on their ability to build war chests, to, you know, they already have staff in place, they have messages, they're able to use the franking privilege, which allows them to send information to their constituents, and can be used in some ways, and there's limits on this, in some ways to kind of get their message, you know, for a re-election. But what we find in this paper is that if you're able to kind of get a hold of media hubs, so people who are very important players politically on Twitter is what we look at. If you're able to grab a hold of those people, well, all of a sudden, you're able to kind of make up those resources without having to have sort of the initial capital to put into it, like you would for traditional media for, you know, for campaigns like TV ads. So it kind of makes up those resources, so it could help in that way, but not every candidate is picked up by those big hubs. So, I mean, there's still some, you know, this is all still in sort of early stages, and we're kind of at the beginning of looking at how social media affects politics and elections, but this is sort of one example that may make it a little bit fairer in that way. It may increase, you know, some good competition against incumbents. Another piece I can sort of think of is, that's kind of a downside to social media. Youth population is the biggest one engaging in social media. And they don't vote, right? They're not really politically active.
Not yet.
In the way we might hope, right? At this point. And so, you know, there's some reason to believe that maybe social media, even though they might be watching politics and looking at political things, they're not getting out of it what we think they might want to get out of it. Let me give you an example. So during the debates, some of the debates, what we'll see, you know, and this is anecdotally, because this research hasn't quite been done yet in a big way, but anecdotally, individual young people are watching the debates, what they'll be looking at is trying to find something that's funny, or something that's kind of ironic, or exciting, shocking, coming out of debates. And they make that famous. And so what the whole point of the debate and the discourse and the discussion of ideas and policies is lost. And all of a sudden it becomes about a politician making a face. So they're watching, they're tuning into politics, but they're not getting out substance. And that's kind of the worry of social media re-elections.
Over here next, please.
Ed.
Small point about the gerrymandering. It was my understanding that one of the effects of gerrymandering is to give more power to the votes of one party and diminish the power. The one person, one vote is skewed. So maybe it's Republican has got 1.5 power, and the Democrat has 0.5 power. Is that shown up in gerrymandering?
So gerrymandering is kind of, it's interesting because so one person, one vote, we try and make the districts be the same size, right? That's the whole idea behind, because one person, one vote. So that, you don't have a very small number of people having a lot of sort of impact versus, a bunch of people having very little impact, fundamentally. What you're referring to is called partisan gerrymandering, where you're drawing the district lines to make sure that there's enough Republicans in that district that member of Congress or whoever's going to run in that district that's open is safe, and that there's very little likelihood that they could lose that election. Now, the import, what happens behind that, is that there's another district that probably is packing all of, the other Democratic voters into a different district. And so that district is not going to be safe for Republicans, right? It's safe for the Democrats in sort of this world that I'm describing to you. So, so there's always going to be some place for those other voters, but the idea is that you're kind of rigging it, and that's what makes us feel like this is not a good idea. Now, states have passed a great many laws to try and eradicate this practice. By the way, there's also something called sweetheart gerrymandering, where it's kind of a collusion, I guess, on the part of parties, incumbents in parties, to try and keep incumbents in power, to protect all the incumbents. And that can go across party lines. There's all sorts of ways to sort of rig the system based on how you draw, because who is in a district has real impacts about who gets elected and who's voting. Another sort of import of this sort of gerrymandering idea is it actually has some good outcomes in some ways. So think about in the 1990s when the Republican Party saw that if you draw district lines in a certain way, you can put it's called packing and it's illegal now, but packing African Americans into one small district. Well, that meant that the districts surrounding were kind of whitewashed, and so they were all voting Republican except for this one district that had African Americans voting for Democrats. Well, sort of the good side of this is that all of a sudden we start to see a spike in the number of members of Congress who are black. So all of a sudden you're doing something to try and rig the system unfairly, but the unintended but beneficial consequence is that now you start to have more Latinos, more blacks, more Asians actually running and winning in Congress and representing districts. So it's, part of it is kind of discussing what are our real goals behind drawing the district lines? What do we want to achieve by it? And I mean, fairness is I think, a great ideal, but it's difficult to put down in legal terms and put on paper. So I think we have to kind of discuss more fully what we're hoping the process will become for drawing lines.
There's somebody there that Joyce gave the mic to. Is that you, Harvey?
Yeah, it is. My question really is related somewhat to the social media issue, but let's go on the other side of that now, since we've just discussed it. I know that there's been discussion about limiting the amount of time that a candidate can have before the election, and also limiting the amount that any candidate can spend. Okay, you want to talk about that?
So basically limiting money in politics, right? The amount that can be spent.
Yeah, in the campaign, yeah.
Yeah, sure, in the campaign. So I doubt that's going to get a lot of traction because based on just sort of the jurisprudence coming out of the United States Supreme Court saying that money is speech. And so when you're telling a candidate that they can no longer spend as much as they have, especially if it's their own money, in the case of Donald Trump, you're hindering his speech as a free citizen. So that could be problematic in that way. Limiting money, there's no doubt about the fact that money in politics is rising. I mean, what the barriers that we broke decades ago with saying, wow, this is the most we've ever spent on a campaign, we're blowing past them with every single election. I can think of examples too, like Beto O'Rourke in Texas. He has raised so much money, he reportedly doesn't know what to do with it. So what he's been doing is he's getting custom T-shirts and sort of kind of handing them out to anybody who wants them, and really engaging in lawn signs for individuals, which if you've ever run a campaign, those are costly things, and you really don't use them unless you have a big sort of supplement. And he's got a supplement. So at some level, is there a ceiling on how much members of Congress will spend to win an election?
Probably not.
No. Yeah.
So in the back, and then I promised Robbie.
Thank you so much for being here. I very much enjoyed listening to you. I'm kind of pleased that the previous question centered on money, and I have heard money and its synonyms used fairly often in your presentation. Perhaps you can't address this because of the scope of your research and your work, but are you aware of any research which suggests a correlation between length of incumbency and increase in net worth of a representative, regardless of party affiliation or ideology?
That's interesting. No, not personal net worth. So I've never seen sort of those two things related. Interestingly enough, I teach a class on Congress at UA, and I was just showing demographics of the sitting Congress right now. And one of those demographics is that the median net worth of members of Congress currently is $1 million. Median, right? So that means that half are above and half are below, but that's not really mirroring the United States, right? So it's problematic. In terms of, kind of them enriching themselves, we have a lot of rules against kind of this flow of money that's political campaign flowing back to the individual. Do I think it's perfect? No. It's certainly, being a member of Congress has its perks, right? And there's actual manuals that they give to members of Congress called Perks of Pay that they can look through and make sure, that things are kosher. But, I haven't seen that kind of research. It would be interesting. I think it would be very shocking if you found a very strong correlation, but it would be interesting.
Thank you. All right, we have one there, and then can you hang for 1 second, Robbie? That's the gentleman in the back, and then you, Robbie.
Would open primary requirement in all states affect polarization?
A lot of people think so, and I tend to agree based on what I've seen. So the idea behind open primaries is that anybody can vote for the party's election, primary election. And what that means is instead of having these intense, polarized individuals voting exclusively for that party, then you get some sort of more outside voices, right? You have to declare which one you're going to vote for, which primary you're going to vote for. But that doesn't mean that a Republican couldn't say, I'm going to vote in the Democratic primary. And they can vote, they're probably going to vote for somebody very different than the Democratic base would. So in that way, I think it would really change who is coming out of the primary system. But my only worry about that is it subverting the primary system and sort of what its goal is. And that's to have somebody who accurately depicts that party, right? So if you have people who are not sort of in mind of keeping with, what the party is, what the partisan lines and what the party wants to achieve, and sort of maybe hoping to come in and kind of subvert that and vote for the weaker candidate, then, what are you achieving at that level as well? So I think you have to also kind of think of the unintended consequences. So maybe it'll help polarization, but, are we strengthening and weakening, do we want to weaken parties? That would be kind of the import of that as well. And there's some evidence to suggest that stronger parties at some level sometimes can mean lower polarization, which is really kind of antithetical, but yeah.
All right, let's go to Robbie, and this will be the last question. I'm hoping you can stay for a little bit afterward and do some caucusing. Hi, Robbie.
Okay. I'm thing. So I think that's a group that we're not hearing from. And also, you talk about Hispanics. It seems to me that they have not been voting in these last elections here in Tucson. At least the people I know who are Hispanic, they're not as excited about it as I am.
No, that's a good point. So, in terms of Native Americans, yeah, I mean, there are polling places that, there are certain states that are more friendly to Native Americans than others, right, in terms of getting you out to the polls and placement of polling places. And actually, I mean, that goes for all of us, right? So, New Mexico passed a law that said that you had to have universal polling places instead of putting them in precincts, which was actually a really good rule in terms of the fact that most people don't actually live and work in the same place. So if you have to leave you leave your house when you go to do your job, then you have to leave your job and then go back to where you live to find a precinct and vote, and then drive all the way back to where you go to work. It's going to take a lot of extra time and effort, and so a lot of people are not willing to put that out, especially given that you might not be paid for those hours if you're an hourly wage worker. So they have to give you time off, but they don't have to pay you. So part of that, so having polling places that are sort of more open and free really does help that. So what New Mexico does is you go over there and you tell them your name, and then they figure out what precinct you are, and they print out the ballot for you. So the other point about this is that what would happen is if you did that in a place that doesn't have universal polling places, you would have to vote provisionally. And when you vote provisionally, basically what happens is you vote in the ballot of the precinct that you go to, you fill out the ballot, and it's put in a special sort of locked box that's not counted immediately with the rest of the votes. Now, later on, there might be some, one of the reasons you might vote provisionally is that you're at the wrong polling place. So if you filled out the ballot, in some states, those ballots will actually, they'll only count the ones that kind of make sense and match for the ballot from your home polling place. So you may have filled out all of the candidates and voted for each person on that ballot at the precinct that was incorrect, but none of those are going to count unless there's also another line on your actual ballot. Now, also, another reason for sort of these provisional ballots is that you didn't have the right ID. And when it comes to Latinos, that's a huge problem. And so when you don't have the right ID, they put them in this provisional box, and usually you actually have to go down to a special location and show them your identification. Tucson and Arizona has one of the hardest ID laws. I mean, it's pretty amazing to me that there's 3 separate lists, and you have to you can pick one from one list, but there's others that you can mix and match. It's just sort of mind-boggling in terms of that. Now, you asked me about mobilizing Latinos. It's a big problem, right? And I don't feel like the literature has adequately answered why Latinos are not voting. We have a lot of reasons why, we know kind of accumulate. There's not really one that I feel like I can hang my hat on and say, this is what we would do to change Latinos voting. I mean, obviously there's a lot of barriers, structural barriers, so I always kind of tell you to think about Latino voting like a funnel. So you have all of the Latinos in the United States, and then you funnel it down by the people who are eligible, age, felon status, and citizenship. And then you kind of funnel it down by are you registered? And there's a lot of barriers to registration for Latinos also, ID being one of them. And then you kind of funnel it down to, okay, well then you have people who are voters. And you funnel down even further to people who actually show up at the polls on voting day. And you have a small trickle of Latino voters who come out. So, I mean, part of the reasons are resources. We have Latinos have very low socioeconomic status. That's a fancy word for saying they have very little income and occupations that are probably not what they might like. That are sort of lower in terms of class distinction. And so, I mean, part of that is that you just don't have, if you're thinking about trying to get to a poll, maybe you don't have enough gas to get there in your car. Or maybe it's as simple as things like, I'm running between 3 jobs and I have, 2 kids and I'm trying to think about making dinner. This is not registering for me because life is happening so fast right now for me. And that's really a reality for a lot of Latino families. Also, they're not being mobilized adequately. So I think Pew Research came out with a statistic recently that said something like 61% of Latinos, I think it was 61, are not mobilized by a candidate or a party, so they're not asked to vote, they're not contacted in that way. And we know from literature on other populations that one of the strongest predictors for whether you vote is whether a candidate or an individual who is important to you or a party comes out and says, have you voted? Are you going to vote? Will you vote? And it sort of pops up the likelihood that you will actually show up at the polls. And if that's not happening for Latinos, they're not going to show up at the polls again. So there's a lot of reasons why Latinos are not voting. Is there any one that I think we can point to and fix immediately? No.
All right, so we are at time. So I want to first of all thank you, Dr.